Alright, today let's talk about European public opinion. They're lamenting that they're being squeezed by both China and the US, suffering a century-old humiliation. The Ministry of Commerce imposed anti-dumping duties on EU pork. At the same time, Europe has to open market to American agricultural products. The EU is acting foolishly, like on September 3rd, when EU Foreign Policy Chief Kallas questioned whether China and Russia won the two world wars. China hit back. On September 5th, China's Ministry of Commerce released an announcement. It ruled that imported pork and pork products originating from the EU are being dumped in China, and decided to implement temporary anti-dumping measures in the form of deposits. The dumping margin for EU companies was determined to be between 15.6% and 62.4%. Starting from September 10th, a temporary anti-dumping tax of 15.6% to 62.4% will be collected in the form of deposits. China's countermeasures have a huge impact on the EU. The temporary anti-dumping tax imposed by the Ministry of Commerce directly raises the price of EU pork products in the Chinese market. For example, EU companies that cooperate with the investigation must first pay a 20% deposit, while companies that do not cooperate face a deposit rate as high as 62.4%. This will significantly weaken the price competitiveness of EU pork compared to products from other countries, such as Brazil and the United States. Chinese importers may reduce or even suspend imports due to increased costs. EU pork may shift to seek other markets. Mia, the vice chairman of the Pork Industry Association, said that this is very bad news for the entire French pork industry. Not only will it affect exports, but it may also put downward pressure on production prices in Europe. EU pork products are extremely important to their overall agricultural economy. Last year, the EU exported 21 million tons of pork products, with 3.9 million tons exported. China was the EU's largest export destination, receiving about 18.6% of the EU's pork exports. According to Global Market News, China is the world's largest pork producer and consumer. For a long time, China's pork supply mainly relied on domestic pig slaughter, with imported pork as a supplement. However, since 2007, pork and pork byproduct import volume has steadily increased, with significant growth. During this period of expansion, the EU became the largest source of pork-related imports for China. According to data from Chinese customs, from 2020 to 2023, pork-related products from the EU accounted for as much as 54% of China's total imports. Due to differences in dietary habits, people in the EU generally don't eat pork trotters, offal, or pig ears, these byproducts. On top of that, there is a significant surplus production capacity in EU pork production. Exporting to China became the obvious choice, a key way to absorb their surplus production. That's why EU pork products maintained their position as the top import source in the Chinese market for a long time. Although it's hard to find the exact annual trade value for all EU pork exports to China, we can look at major European pork exporting countries as examples. Last year, France exported 115,000 tons of pork products to China, totaling 240 million euros, and Spain also exported a significant amount of pork products to China last year. In total, that's 520 million euros. Since Spain, France, Denmark, and the Netherlands are all major EU countries exporting pork to China, it's estimated that the EU exports several billion euros worth of pork and pork byproducts to China every year. But after China increases tariffs, all of that could vanish. On one hand, the EU is facing major obstacles exporting pork to China, while on the other hand, it's opening up its agricultural market to the US, making it easier for American pork to enter. According to the trade agreement framework reached between the US and Europe, the EU has to open its market to American agricultural products and offer preferential terms. Although US pork isn't completely tariff-free when entering the EU, it does get priority market access and more convenient conditions. Still, don't underestimate the impact of these changes. In 2024, mainstream pork exports reached 3.03 million tons, a 4% increase, with export value at $8.63 billion, both hitting record highs. Mexico is the largest market for pork exports, with 1.15 million tons exported, followed by Japan, South Korea, and China in the Asia-Pacific. However, pork exports to the EU are negligible, because the EU has set trade barriers, imposing strict food safety, animal welfare, and environmental standards on pork imports. For example, ractopamine and other additives have greatly restricted US pork imports. However, under the property agreement between the US and the EU will remove tariffs on all US industrial goods and offer preferential treatment to US agricultural products, including pork. Market access will be improved by removing non-tariff barriers for US pork, and both sides have agreed to simplify requirements for sanitary certificates for US pork and dairy products. This means the EU will be forced to reduce trade barriers on pork imports. Regarding China's September 3rd military parade, foreigners had opposite reactions. The smart ones, take Indonesia for example, saw protests erupting across the country. President Prabowo even announced he would cancel his visit to China on September 3rd. But in the end, it was surprising to see him on the official stage. He caught a flight to Beijing in the early hours of September 3rd to attend the parade. When Chairman Xi Jinping was delivering his speech on the afternoon of September 3rd, I felt that overcoming difficulties to come to China and attend the commemorative event showed something. This shows the importance of the relationship between the two countries. The foolish ones would be the EU. The Slovak Prime Minister was the only leader from the 11 EU member states to attend the Beijing parade. After Beijing expressed regret and lack of understanding over the EU's absence, the Estonian Foreign Minister Kallas added fuel to the fire, saying China and Russia did not win World War II, distorting history to criticize China. You can imagine China's anger. The second consequence came immediately. China's anti-dumping duties on EU pork products began after the EU unilaterally imposed heavy anti-subsidy tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. China and the EU then negotiated for over a year without results. Even after China and the US reached a preliminary trade agreement, China and the EU made no progress. So, after imposing anti-dumping duties on EU brandy, China also added them to EU pork products. This is quite normal. The EU is stubborn, insisting on following the outgoing Biden administration, just running into a wall without knowing how to turn. If China doesn't buy as much EU pork offal, pig trotters, or pig ears, it's no big deal, they can just buy more American pork instead. Third, the EU is stuck in a dilemma. Its pork products are attacked from both sides, they can't sell to China, and at the same time, they face competition from American pork. China is waiting for EU farmers to push von der Leyen and Kallas out of office, so China and the EU can start a new, normal relationship. On top of that, foreign media lamenting that the EU is squeezed by China and the US, suffering a century of humiliation hell. On September 3rd, the EU news site Europe Dynamics was merciless in its review, listing out the major diplomatic setbacks Europe has suffered in recent months. At the G7 summit in June, there were some rather awkward and humiliating moments for the EU. In July, the EU and the US signed a severely unbalanced trade agreement. And then, a fake senior Chinese official went to Brussels to attend the 50th anniversary EU-China summit. Europe Dynamics said that all the talk about the world being in a European moment is now outdated, and what has replaced it is a fear of entering a century of humiliation, what China experienced in the 19th century during its century of national humiliation bullied by various great powers. On September 1st, Sarajevo Times in Bosnia drew a parallel, comparing the EU's current situation to when Britain forced China to sign the humiliating Treaty of Nanking. The article suggests the EU faces its own century of humiliation. But this story of humiliation is not over. While European media mock themselves Europe's summer of surrender, their recent diplomatic failures. What's even worse is that this hellish summer has seamlessly transitioned into a hellish autumn. As soon as the new school term started after the summer holidays, the EU stumbled again. On September 5th, Trump published an article in the global media, fiercely criticizing the EU for imposing a $3.5 billion antitrust fine on that company, calling the move extremely unfair. He accused them of seizing funds that should have been used for investment and employment in the US, and said the US government would not tolerate such discriminatory actions. Trump warned that if Europe continued to take similar measures against American tech giants, he would be forced to invoke Section 301 to overturn these unfair penalties. European media revealed that, due to pressure from President Trump, the relevant committee was considering delaying the antitrust fine against Google. This move sparked public outcry and anger from the European Parliament. The EU Commission's Director General for Trade, Jean-Luc Demarty, also faced criticism in Parliament, with some members threatening to veto the tariff agreement reached between the EU and the US. European Parliament member Bernd Lange declared that, when facing people who use tariffs as a weapon of extortion, the EU can no longer give in. On another note, the EU seems to have a mysterious competence when dealing with China. Criticism regarding the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit and China's September 3rd military parade. Even the United States wouldn't do this. According to the South China Morning Post, the SCO Summit and the September 3rd military parade have deepened external perceptions. While other countries and regions lead the global political agenda, the EU is left out, while China, Russia, and India chatted closely at the SCO Summit. 2 days later, the leaders of China, Russia, and North Korea appeared at the military parade, with images broadcast worldwide, highlighting the emergence of a new world order. On September 3rd, EU Foreign Minister Kallas, shouting like this, calling it wrong, irresponsible? An authoritarian alliance? Actually, this reflects a sense of powerlessness. From Kallas's rambling remarks, you can see the EU's crisis. In the global tech war, China vies for dominance. James Kinge, a former Financial Times reporter and author of China's Quest for Global Tech Supremacy, when he saw China's military parade, it showcased China's military expertise, but it's more than that, it's also a declaration that China has become a global leader. A technological powerhouse, he believes that this will trigger long-term shockwaves in Europe and around the world for many years to come. Earlier, it was said that EU leaders have always tried to package the EU as a geopolitical force, but now all their efforts have come to nothing. In recent days, and also in the past few weeks, actions by the US and China have shown that the EU's attempts to win favor are only convincing when they are backed by real power. The conclusion is that the EU doesn't actually have real power, but keeps repeating the same old American narrative about authoritarianism versus democracy, acting all high and mighty, when in reality, it's not worth much at all.